I was just trying to look at the impact of land use regulations on housing prices.
Dr. Larry Katz has been an incredibly influential economist since graduating from MIT in 1985. He's the Elizabeth Allison Professor of Economics at Harvard and the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics, arguably the #1 or #2 journal in economics, depending on who you ask. As editor, he's been part of profound shifts in economics, including watching as the credibility revolution overtook the applied work within the profession and publishing some of the most important scientific articles in the profession. He was also chief economist at the Department of Labor during the Clinton administration in 93 and 94, and has produced important work on the role of education and skill in labor markets, as well as the importance of neighborhoods in families' lives. In this interview, Dr. Katz shares his thoughts about his own career and interests as a labor economist, as well as his views about the forces that shapes the lives of workers. As always, I'm Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape, the podcast. Okay, so Dr. Katz, it's really nice to meet you in person. I've been a longtime admirer of your work. Ever since in graduate school, we read your paper with Kevin Murphy in the 92 QJE on relative wage changes, and this just had a big effect on me. Because it was really the first, it seemed like it was one of the first true labor papers I'd ever read. And I've just been a big fan ever since. And so I wanted to say thank you for letting me interview you for this podcast.
Well, Scott, thank you for the kind words. And we can go with Larry rather than Dr. Katz.
Okay, I'll go with Larry. All right. So before we kind of get into some questions, I was going to ask you about labor and the QJE and things like that. I also just felt like I don't really know a lot about your background. And I was just wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what you sort of remember most when you think about that time as a young person.
Sure. Well, I largely grew up in Los Angeles in the Valley. So if you want to think of the world of things like Valley Girl and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, if you want popular culture versions of where and when I grew up, that would probably be a reasonable measure of what life was like for me as a teenager in some sense. The cultural and other influences exactly in that area of LA and the Valley.
Oh, wow. I'm trying to picture you in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which character you may have been in that movie.
Yeah, not much clear. Probably the nerdy one working in the mall.
Okay, not that.
It would be closer to where I would show up rather than Sean Penn or something.
Yeah, Sean Penn's character. Well, so you went to Berkeley for college. I was wondering a little bit about your high school years and how you ended up sort of going to Berkeley. What drew you to it? I mean, I know it's a great school, but I was just sort of interested in that.
I mean, I went to the public high school, nearby Birmingham, which was actually a reasonably diverse place in the sense that it was sort of voluntary busing. So there was actually a large Hispanic, reasonable, Black group, as well as sort of Jewish kids from Encino and working class kids from Van Nuys. So it was in the Valley. And while the school was highly diverse, it was highly tracked. So the classes I tended to have, were much less diverse than, say, the sports teams I was on and stuff.
Right.
And, I sort of ran cross country and track. I was big into speech and debate, which probably got me most interested in sort of economics and, political science sort of issues. And, I think my mother was a big influence on this. She worked in the LA city schools as a school psychologist, worked in a lot of very diverse and lower income schools. So I got a sense of the problems of other kids and of segregation from her work. and always had sort of interest in segregation, inequality, discrimination, I think coming from her influence.
Okay.
And I think I ended up at Berkeley, largely being the UC, being free and not having a whole lot of knowledge of other places to go, and seemed like the best public university around, and they accepted me. I'd done some work. I'd done some classes at UCLA when I was in high school. There was a honors program that allowed you to take classes at UCLA. So in the strange world of University of California academics, all those credits transferred to Berkeley. So I arrived at 18 starting college and was declared a sophomore and had to declare my college major, after one quarter. And so I think I ended up in economics because in my first quarter as a freshman, political science was at 8 a.m. and economics was at 10 a.m. And I decided I wasn't going to take a class at 8 a.m. So I ended up taking, Ec 1.
Yeah, that's right. Right. It's funny, the stuff that puts you on a path. So you were always interested in inequality.
I certainly was. From then I was interested in sort of inequality and race, and, and then I ended up, when I was an undergraduate, I was interested in macro and sort of labor, but I ended up working a bunch in housing and land use regulation and segregation. I was the first employee of the Center for Real Estate and Urban Economics at UC Berkeley from a new faculty member there named Ken Rosen, who was an urban economist, housing person who had come there from Princeton. And I was the research assistant and only employee at that time. I think it's a pretty big center now. And so, I did work with him on land use regulations and then wrote a senior thesis about sort of how California and particularly the Bay Area was becoming much more restrictive in housing regulations, and actually did a survey of all the jurisdictions in the Bay Area and actually tried to estimate something that I guess today we would call sort of a border, RD sort of approach.
Oh, really?
I got housing data from the real estate brokers in the Bay Area, and then tried to estimate like what we would call today the treatment effect of having a more regulated jurisdiction versus less regulated jurisdiction on housing prices by comparing sort of small jurisdictions on one side of a border where they restricted development, on the other side of the border they didn't, to see if that sort of capitalized into prices. So that was my beginning foray of sort of, I would never have called it that. I just thought I was like running regressions and doing comparisons, but I guess that's what we would call it today.
What year was that?
1980.
Wow. So I usually think of that as like the influence of Princeton and the industrial relations, this Nobel kind of tradition. But you're doing this kind of treatment effect analysis or quasi.
We didn't call it treatment effect. I just called it a regression.
He's called it a regression.
I'm saying effectively it was doing that, but it had none of the current language of treatment effect. It was just like, what was a good way of controlling? Obviously, one was worried that different jurisdictions would have different things that would lead to different prices, amenities. If you were sort of next to each other, then that sounded like a better comparison. So let's try to focus on the ones where, across a border, you had different policies. I mean, that was then adopted by a student of mine many years later, Sandy Black.
I was just about to say that.
As sort of for schools, I did this for land use regulation, and Leah Bustan and other students sort of did this for looking at sort of amenities in the suburbs versus cities for the Black migration. And so, I had no clue this had anything to do with what we would currently call formal identification. And, and I don't think it went anywhere until the, people like, David Card, Josh, and Hito formalized all these things. And, Angrist and Lavie, a paper I published in the late 90s, and the QJA was sort of push formal RD into the economics literature, I think.
Wow. That's interesting. So I guess I don't really fully have the correct story. I always feel like there was this discrete change in thinking about empiricism with Orley and Card and Kruger, but if you're not even over there and you're thinking this way, it seems like but it does seem kind of original the way that you're thinking about empiricism, the way you're describing it all the way back in 1980, thinking about it as causal effects, even though I know you're saying
we didn't have any language like that. I was just trying to look at the impact of land use regulations on housing prices, and this is sort of what I thought. There was no formalization. It was published in the Journal of Law and Economics, Ken Rosen, in 1987, and it just looks like a kitchen sink regression, but effectively that's what it is. You would never think of any of the language of current causal inference. So this was not deep, this was just intuition. This was not deep insight into this is a causal estimator.
That's neat. Your interest in labor, then I was going to ask you, how you got so interested in labor. And I feel like you kind of said it, but was there particular influences besides your mom and those personal experiences?
Well, I sort of took a labor economics course as an undergraduate with an old style labor guy named Lloyd Ullman, who probably no one has ever heard of, who actually was a pretty distinguished labor historian, economist at Berkeley. He'd served in the CEA and the Kennedy administration, had written a classic book on the rise of industrial trade unions. There was a lot of focus on unions, but it sort of gave a basic, labor economics training. And I was sort of, in that period, high unemployment, stagflation, wage setting. So it was sort of doing macro labor type things. That was what I was interested in when I entered sort of graduate school,
right?
That and sort of inequality and segregation.
Yeah. Was it, so that was from just the very beginning. When you say it like that, I can see the labor macro kind of broad. You mentioned urban, but was there something about labor as a field that just, really captivated your passion?
I think when I was at MIT as a PhD student, everyone hot was doing macro. So I was sort of in macro labor, but I found myself more interested in the labor side than the monetary and others. So, I did fields in labor and macro and worked with sort of Hank Farber and Catherine Abraham in labor, but Olivier Blanchard in sort of macro. And when I went out on the market, the world defined me as a labor economist, even though I was working in labor and macro. I didn't have a clear sense of it at that time. I was sort of interested in issues and things.
Yeah, you mentioned political science. You were kind of always interested in the applied, policy-oriented kinds of styles of empirical work. Yeah. Before I talk about the QJE, I also just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some specific things. So that paper, Changes in Relative Wages, with Kevin Murphy, it had a real big impact on me because I hadn't really, my background was a literature major as an undergrad. And so it was sort of one of my first exposures to substantive labor, like substantive economics in general. And I was really interested because it suggested inequality was emerging because of this skill, returns to skill and technology and things like that. But it seems like the literature kind of shifted a little bit and began to also emphasize these institutional factors like poverty and discrimination. And I was just kind of curious, what was your sense of those debates over the causes of inequality, returns to education, returns to skill, technology, and then these kind of other areas that sort of emphasize monopsony and imperfect competition and racial discrimination, just like these other worlds. What's your sense about those two?
My view is all of them are important, and you need to have a historical sort of perspective and a broad perspective. I came at this originally more from the institutions and imperfect labor markets. So when I was graduate student, the early work I did was actually more on labor market frictions, efficiency, wages, rents, access to good jobs, high wage jobs, as a source of sort of inequality, and and those factors leading to more discrimination. But it was as the 80s, evolved and we saw rising inequality. The work I was doing, some on my own and some with Kevin Murphy, we sort of saw that, we had debated a lot. I had argued that a lot of industry differences were sort of monopsony, power, efficiency, wages, rent differences, and Kevin was everything's a competitive. But what we both agreed on was that as inequality was rising in the 80s, it was happening in every industry. It wasn't that industry differences or firm differences were getting bigger. It was within every sector, education differences were sort of widening. The gaps between college and non-college is what we saw in the data. And we sort of tried to see how far you could go with a simple sort of competitive model of the labor market where you thought about, different workers differentiated by education, by experience, potentially by gender and race, being treated by firms, as differentiated inputs, and their relative demand depending on technology, depending on consumer taste, depending on international trade, and their relative supply by access to education and by demographics. And what we found, if you applied that to the sort of data of the sort of mid 20th century to the late 80s, is that you found in the mid 20th century very rapid growth of the supply of more educated workers that sort of kept in check a growing demand for more educated workers from technological change, but that a slowdown in access to sort of higher education and a falling apart of sort of high schools in the US meant that the same sort of demand shifts from technology generated widening inequality. So it's this sort of explanation goes back to Jan Tinbergen, who shared the first Nobel Prize in economics, which he called the race between education and technology, which Claudia Golden and I, sort of stole for the title of our book later on, looking at the sort of century-long changes in inequality. So what we found is you did quite well, and it was illuminating. You could understand why the timing of changes in inequality differed for younger versus older workers within this framework, where in the education distribution. And so it was a rich sort of framework. And the way I've always thought about this, and this was formalized in some work that Richard Freeman and I did, and then in the handbook chapter I wrote with David Otter when he was a graduate student in the late 90s, is what I call the supply-demand institutions framework. So you can think of actual wages of anybody as being a mixture of the latent, unknown competitive wage, if the world were as Adam Smith laid out, completely competitive, and there were no frictions, no barriers. And then you can think of some deviation from it, which could be a rent in either direction. It could be an efficiency wage where a firm pays you higher than your competitive outside option, or it could be monopsony power where they're able to have a wedge and be lower. And the actual wage is sort of, you can think of the relative rent and the wage is the product of that. And you can then think of supply and demand factors affect the latent competitive wage, and institutional factors, which are broadly defined. It could be market power, it could be discriminatory practices, it could be efficiency wage considerations, minimum wages, impact that relative rent component. And then as an empiricist, you see the actual wages and actual quantities. The advantage of the competitive model is it's a really clear way of combining both the information on quantities and wages in a coherent way where you can interpret all the sort of parameters if you have reasonably exogenous changes in supply or demand. The institutions sort of developed on a piece-by-piece basis. Let's sort of look at the impact of unions. Let's sort of look at the impact of minimum wages. But it was hard to integrate them all together. So the literature sort of developed, I would say, that three different approaches. The approach that Kevin Murphy and I took, and Claudia Golden and I, and some work David Otter and I have done, was what I would say supply and demand first. We treat the actual wages as if they were the latent competitive wages and see how far you can go with supply and demand.
Yeah.
And that does very well for long run changes, but has lots of puzzles. You can't explain how much wages compressed in the 40s with that. You need a rise of unions and government wage setting and the minimum wage. You get the timing sort of wrong in the late 70s. There's too much compression because of strong unions in the 70s and a high minimum wage, and then too much of an explosion in the 80s. And it's not doing that great in the 2000s to early 2010s. But, if you do 150, 200 years, which we've done, it's a pretty good long run explanation, a secular increase in technology that favors more educated workers, and periods where access to education grow, keeps it in check, and you get shared prosperity. In periods where we don't have good access to education, you see rising inequality. But you can then do piece by piece institutions. You can find a natural experiment on unions or on the minimum wage, sort of the work Card and Kruger have done, or, Allen and I, Kruger and I did, to sort of try to get the minimum wage component and sort of treat that as exogenous and first. And the first approach that Kevin and I did, or Claudia and I, overstates probably the supply and demand. And the second approach sort of overstates the institutions by sort of giving the common variance. Or you could go fully structural and try to incorporate them all. And, I think some people are trying to do that, but often that comes at sacrificing the richness of the competitive model, or having the clean identification on the sort of, individual components of the sort of rents and institutions. So there's no perfect solution. A lot of young macro people sort of try to integrate these together in, more structural models, but they often have. And as you work on the supply and demand models, you see there are a lot of big mistakes you can make by doing that. How you aggregate things hugely affects your answers. If you set up a model with some simple, assumption that everyone's equally substitutable in different groups, and you treat 23-year-old high school dropouts as being equally substitutable with 50-year-old PhD computer scientists as they are with 24-year-old high school dropouts, you're going to get nonsensical answers. And a lot of the structural modeling actually has that approach. We say there are 10 groups or 50 groups, and we assume they all have a CES substitutability that's the same. And what Kevin and I tried to show is those choices of aggregation, having groups that are highly similar together and very different, is where, if you want to do 100 years ago, high school is the real margin where workers were differentiated in the labor market. Today, it's becoming a BA or even greater than a BA, or specialized skills. And so some of the sacrifices of more structural modeling are, do great disservice to the data, which is why I tend to favor, sort of a thoughtful supply and demand approach, or directly looking at institutions.
That time with Kevin Murphy, was that a pretty memorable part of your intellectual sort of trajectory?
Yeah, no, Kevin was just amazing. He could think through any price theory problem, and still can, quicker than anyone I've ever seen. And, this was just in the transition from SAS to Stata. Finus Welch had sort of developed Stata, and Kevin was just sort of a Stata whiz, because he had sort of, he was just a genius. And so, in those days, it wasn't that easy to sort of put 25 CPSs together and run them on mainframe computers or on PCs. And Kevin could sort of invert matrices in his head and figure out, he could figure out things, that Stata didn't know it could do, because he had the logic. If it can do A and can do B, I can figure out a way of combining A and B to do something you wouldn't have figured out. I've never been able to do that, but Kevin was just amazing.
Yeah, that's great. That's neat. What have been so as you sort of look back on the journey you've kind of been on as an economist, what have sort of been the most influential milestones for you in terms of people or work that you did?
I mean, there have just been lots of influences. When I was an undergrad, I think Laura Tyson's undergraduate intermediate macro class was very influential, and she was sort of one of my undergraduate advisors. The work I did on urban and housing, land use regulation with Ken Rosen and Lloyd Ullman, sort of old style labor. In graduate school, my advisor, Hank Farber, and Catherine Abraham who was a labor economist. Then at the Sloan School when I was at MIT, she really influenced me both from understanding labor markets, but thinking about the importance of measurement and not just sticking with the standard data sets. If there wasn't a vacancy series, could you create it from help wanted, and how would you assess whether that's realistic? I mean, she went on to be the commissioner of labor statistics at BLS and has been a real leader in improving the infrastructure of sort of data, something that, Alan Kruger, a student and co-author of mine, later sort of went on to do. I'd say, those in, I think the macro people like Olivier Blanchard, Stan Fisher, and Rudy Dornbush. And in recent years, in the last decades, Claudia Golden has been, my lodestone and my intellectual guidance and correcting me on everything, and certainly has helped, put the big sort of historical picture into thinking about things. A lot of work on sort of inequality takes an ahistorical perspective, and then you can say, wow, technology is associated with these problems, but why 40 years ago, when there was a lot of technological change, 50 years ago, didn't you see inequality changing? And then you need to bring in education or bring in institutions. If you focus too much in one time and place, you get a pretty limited, narrow view. And so I've tried to combine, trying to find RCTs and natural experiments to get inputs, but then thinking about the broader, long run historical picture to have a better perspective of what's going on.
Yeah. It's funny you said how you that time at Berkeley working with housing, that center, and then I think about you associated so closely with moving to opportunity. What was that? So I was curious what you feel like when you went into the moving to opportunity research. What were you sort of thinking you would find, and what has been the most surprising or unexpected things that you learned from it?
Sure. Yeah, so moving to opportunity is a randomized housing mobility experiment that was implemented from 1994 to 1996 across 5 US cities: Boston, Baltimore, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, where people living in the highest poverty areas, poverty rates above 40% in public housing, were offered in a lottery vouchers to have freer choice of where to move with their housing support. Same value as public housing in terms of how much housing would cost, but gave them flexibility. In one treatment, they were given a regular Section 8, now known as housing choice voucher, and able to move. In the other, it was restricted. They could only move to a low poverty area that had an under 10% poverty rate. But we gave them help with housing mobility counselors to move there. So the first question we asked was, could you actually help low-income households move to low poverty areas? And when we designed this experiment, I was actually there at its origins. I was the chief economist of the US Department of Labor in 93, 94 in the Clinton administration. And this came out of an urban bill passed in late 92 following the Rodney King LA riot, when for a brief moment, Congress was interested in throwing some money at urban problems and segregation and discrimination problems. And so in the Clinton administration, we made sure that some of the money was used for demonstration projects with actual random assignment. And that was the origin of moving to opportunity. A working group in the administration, which HUD was the lead, sort of designed this in 93. And luckily, several years later, when I was an academic, I was able to get involved in the evaluation with a couple of graduate students, then Jeff Kling and Jeff Liebman, and we bid on one of the original contracts for one site, and then worked with other groups in sort of getting the longer run evaluation. And so when we had designed it, it was called Moving to Opportunity. I think HUD thought it was going to greatly improve the labor market outcomes of the adults, and that would be a channel to improve the outcomes for the children in those households. What turned out was surprising. The move seemed to have no impacts on the economic outcomes of the adults, largely adult female-headed households. And in the short run, didn't seem to do a lot for the kids. It did, there were some differences. Girls seemed to be doing better psychologically and a little bit better in school. Boys, not so much. But, so a lot of this was written off with the early findings. We found huge effects on the mental health and physical health of the adults and on girls, which I thought was quite important because reducing depression and anxiety is pretty important. But economists sort of dismissed the early results as evidence that neighborhoods sort of didn't matter. And sociologists went crazy at us saying that, well, this just isn't a good experiment. A lot of people may have moved out of their neighborhoods, even though we had random assignment, they didn't want to believe it. Then, so the interim, the results look like that. But I was always saying, well, there are good reasons to think that, in fact, it's hard for adults. The exact neighborhood you live in probably doesn't matter that much for your outcome. You're working in the same city labor market. There's discrimination facing you, whether you work in one area or not. But if your kids have a chance to get a better education, form connections, speak, in some sense, more the language that employers are looking at, maybe that will matter, but we're not going to know that when your kid's 8. We're going to need to see them as adults. So we, there was not money from Congress, but we raised money from a bunch of different foundations to track people longer on. And then eventually with Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren, we were able to gain access to the IRS data to track these kids, when they were young adults. And we found striking findings that getting the opportunity to move to a lower poverty area meant that when you were in your 20s or early 30s, huge improvements. The estimated treatment untreated was in the 30 to 40% range on earnings from high exposure. And what's striking is Raj and Nathan were doing this large scale quasi experimental movers study. And strikingly, MTO looked just like the quasi-experimental estimates. The greater the number, earlier you move, the larger the effect of moving to a nicer neighborhood that looked like this exposure time sort of model of neighborhood influences. So for kids, the amount of time you spend in a safer environment really matters. For adults, your current, so there are 2 types of neighborhood effects. There's sort of developmental or exposure, that your long run outcomes depend. That really matters for kids. For certain things like health, contextual current ones really matter. How safe your environment is today matters a lot for your mental health and even for your physical health. Do you have the opportunity to safely go out and exercise? But it doesn't matter that much for your earnings if you don't do other things to give you the opportunity to form connections, invest in skills. And so other work we've done has shown that sort of training and education programs combined with those moves can do big things for the earnings of the adults, but the neighborhood environment itself doesn't have as big an effect. That's not to say space doesn't matter, but it's in a broader geographic area. So if your local labor market's depressed versus booming, matters a lot for your income and your outcome, but it's more the level of the Boston metro area than it is whether you live in one block in Roxbury or in one block of Brookline.
Right. That's fascinating. So that was a big surprise. So was it a big surprise for you to sort of think in terms of these short run, long run effects? And
I mean, I think we were much more hopeful because there was something called the spatial mismatch hypothesis that was that argued the exact neighborhood you mattered and access to jobs should be the key thing to labor market outcomes. And it was based on a lot of observational evidence, but of course, they're huge, selection biases. People who live in areas that don't have a lot of job access don't have better opportunities to move to other areas. So we don't know what's what selection these people have, and it depends a lot on transportation options. So there was a big hope that moving people to lower unemployment, higher EPOP areas would immediately improve the adult outcomes. And we didn't, find that. And so, there were a bunch of arguments. Well, maybe that's because they were better areas, but they weren't good enough, or, they were slightly declining, and you can't fully rule them out. But I think the similar results from sort of the public housing demolitions projects of Eric Shin and a bunch of other mobility things, whereas mobility across broader geography of labor market seems to have very big effects on some adult outcomes and some of the adult moves in the, so I think the version I have is, there's a broader labor market that matters a lot for adult outcomes, and your skills, connections, discrimination matter a lot, but it's not your exact zip code within an area for adults. But for kids, it has a huge influence on, who their connections are, what their human capital is, that matters a lot for later outcomes. And so it clearly targeting, trying to desegregate neighborhoods, give access to better schooling stuff. The earlier you start, the bigger the long run payoff. But the other finding, which has been underappreciated, is that it's not the sort of story of if you don't do stuff by age 2, you can't do anything to improve things. 14-year-olds who lived in a better area from 14 to 18 get as much impact as someone from 4 to 8. We found, there's not like, teens benefit hugely from being in safer, better areas, or having, a stronger school and others. And a lot of the second chance programs that we're seeing that are sort of some of the work I've been doing recently on what we call sectoral employment training programs, which sort of combine, a whole bunch of wraparound services, what you might call life skills or soft skills training with job development, as well as, sort of coding camp training or training as a health technician, or others, seem to have huge sort of payoffs, with people in their, young adults from 18 to 24, but also women, trying to enter the labor market in their 30s and their 40s. So this notion that sometime that, unless you only get there early, there's nothing you can do. I think there's huge evidence, and the recent review by Nathan Hendren and one of our students, Ben Sprungkaiser, of hundreds of programs shows, in general, programs for younger people have higher returns, but it's not that you have, it would be better if we got there earlier, but the notion that we should write off people after, early childhood seems highly problematic. We have a lot of valuable interventions later on.
So it's not really an early childhood intervention story the way that it's kind of popularly described.
No, in fact, all the identifying variation from MTO that's in the Chetty Hendren and Katz paper is actually not early childhood, because the ones who were that early weren't old enough to have adult outcomes yet. It's sort of from ages, 6 to sort of 18.
Wow. It's almost like
if you were 2 at the time you moved, you weren't old enough to be 25 to 30, 18 years later.
Do you think that you could have had the exact same result with a busing intervention? Is it that mechanism?
Well, we have seen very similar results. This is Rucker Johnson's work.
Yeah. So is that to suggest that it's like a busing they're both kind of similar mechanisms as opposed to
there seem to be both. Schooling is one big input, but there seems to be neighborhoods have impacts beyond schooling. So what we see is in some of the, so busing can have a huge effect, the schooling quality or anything that improves schooling quality without changing your neighborhood can have big effects. We see this from charter school studies. We see this from work on going back to Carden Kruger, from improving school resources to sort of the quasi-experimental school finance equalization literature by Kirbo Jackson, Rucker Johnson and Nicola Persico in the QJ 2015 is a good example. But what you see is that, with the neighborhoods, some of it is from improved schools. So in Los Angeles, which was one site of MTO, there was substantial improvement in school quality with the moves in neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. But in Boston and in Baltimore and Chicago, the school quality, think of neighborhood quality going from like the 5th percentile to the 40th percentile in a citywide distribution. But school quality went from sort of the 15th percentile to the 20th. Mm-hmm. And the reason is there was already a bit of school choice, so that schools were not as actually segregated as neighborhoods at that time in many of these cities, like New York had a bunch of it. And the nature of the neighborhoods you can move in a housing voucher is you can get into a safer, better neighborhood, but it often doesn't get you into the better school because of neighborhood. So what we found is part of the MTO effect seems to be schools, but there seems to be an independent neighborhoods effect. And you can see similar things from that in, some interventions where you sort of change neighborhood quality, but not schooling so much. But they're both, so it's not the same thing as busing. They both sort of mattered, but it's certainly an important component of it. And there's some nice work in Montreal with quasi-experimental by Lala Berthe, that shows, in that case, maybe the schooling, 60% of the neighborhood effects, but it isn't the whole thing. There's other, there are clearly things having to do with connections, things having to do just with safety and health. Even things like being in a less polluted area seems to have long run impacts.
That's a good point, because busing's not going to really, well, I guess busing could affect the mental health of a parent, but it's very
neighborhood
different.
Environments,
having environments of just
a big part of that is the schooling bundle, but it's not the whole thing.
I want to talk about the QJE, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, is many people would probably say it's of the top 5, it's the top 2 or top 1, even of all of our journals. And it's just been, your tenure there has just been, it seems like, so impactful. It's really hard to even know what effect it had on the profession. So I was just kind of curious, what do you think has been the impact of the Quarterly Journal of Economics at your time on the profession, in particular the applied work?
Yeah, well, I think that, we have explicitly tried to do a number of things to, reduce turnaround time, which I think has been very, when I started at the QJE and took over for Larry Summers, I remember going into his office, this is before there were online submissions and electronics, and just seeing piles and piles of folders of papers that hadn't been decided on, some 3 years old and stuff that I had to deal with to get rid of the backlog. And just, that was not helping anyway. So we sort of went to, my sense was that if the editors had a commitment to quick turnaround, referees would start seeing that was the norm. If you saw that the elasticity of your coming back in quickly to actually being informed of the decision was very high, you would respond to that, and social norms would sort of matter. And I think we were very quickly able to, reduce turnaround time from, 6 months to a year to, median turnaround time of 1 day because of desk rejects and conditional on, being sent out being more in the sort of, 30-day range, which I think is much more reasonable. So I think we explicitly tried to be a bit, when we were starting out, tried to be thematic. We wanted to do some work on inequality. We sort of wanted to do more work on growth, which was growing empirical work then in the early 90s. And I explicitly wanted to sort of take advantage of what I was seeing of the credibility revolution of sort of trying to publish innovative papers that use new experimental and quasi-experimental methods, and tried to give that a forum as sort of a way of highlighting that work and pushing it. And so, I think some of the, papers I was really proud of were sort of like the Angrist and Kruger, quarter of birth IV compulsory schooling paper in 91 was a good early version of sort of showing the power of sort of a quasi-experiment. In the late 90s, sort of the Angrist Lavie Maimonides law is sort of an example. Also in 99, the Kruger Tennessee Star
Yeah.
RCT showing the power of randomized, sort of control trials. And, so a whole range, sort of we ran a special issue in 96, just on trying to shift economics to thinking more about social problems and using sort of quasi-experimental methods, people like Steve Levitt. There's even a paper by George Akerlof and Janet Yellen on sort of abortion. And
yeah, I remember that paper. Yeah, it's a great paper.
So we sort of tried to sort of push things we thought were interesting areas, technological change and inequality, growth, and tried to sort of push it. But also, I think the key was not stringing people along with endless revision processes and, basically thinking of the revise and resubmit as a contract.
Right. Right.
That, the editor did not say just convince the referees when the referees were contradictory. The editor basically says, these are the 4 points the referees raised that you really need to address. You can ignore the others. And, these are the 3 things I think you should do. And effectively, if you do that, you're accepted. If the results don't look as great, that's the way the world is. There are papers I've published where the results are mushier than probably ideal, but that's I think that's a much better sort of approach than these endless contradictory revisions, which had been my experience as sort of an author.
Sure.
Prior to that,
sure. I know this is not an answerable question, but it's interesting that you sort of brought that up. I wonder if you hadn't been editor for this time at the QJE, if the credibility revolution would have been as widespread then, since that was something you were so open-minded to and so interested in, randomization and natural experiments.
Well, I mean, Orley was also an editor of the AR.
That's right. Yeah. He was editor.
There were a couple of places where there was a big, so hard to know these counterfactuals.
Right.
My guess is editors probably don't have that big an effect, but maybe some. I certainly know that the regime change of the QJ had an effect on the citation rate. I mean, there is a reasonably good regression discontinuity. I know Raj Chetty once put together a graph and Stefano Della Vigna of sort of the citation rates of articles in the QJ before and after our sort of shift in the editorial team in the early 90s. And we had been sort of forever, number 3 or 4 among the major journals and jumped to number 1, in 91. And I think something like 30 out of the last 31 years, we've been number 1 on any citation measure.
Wow. That's really interesting. That's got to feel, it's a widespread, the social norms are very clear that, you're expected to get this stuff back in a reasonable amount of time. And it's been really, it does seem like it's been really impactful across the board.
Yeah, and I think there's been a real push. I think Esther Duflo really pushed that at the at the AR, improving after doing that at the AJs. I think a lot of the AJs. So I think there's been there's still a lot of delays out there, but I think there has been some shift. I think the big the other big change, which is I think sometimes misinterpreted. So there's a lot of argument that papers are too long in economics and do too much stuff, and people point to other. I think there's probably a bifurcation. I think it's great to have an AER Insights with shorter one idea papers, and it's good to have things like that in science. But I also think a comprehensive paper, a paper by a Raj Chetty or Michael Kremer or a Mario, someone that sort of puts together the results from, doesn't just, puts together results in an area so they're all there in one place and you can learn them, has the experiment, the quasi-experimental, the conceptual framework, actually is better for teaching and understanding than having to go to 5 different papers. People sort of think, well, other fields have really short papers. Well, if you actually look at it, they've actually written 6 results. They have 6 results from what would have been one, economics paper in the QJ or the AR, but it's 6 different science papers that all have the same introduction. You know, it's not clear there's a huge gain from that. I think there's a little bit of an illusion on what's called a paper versus what's sort of set out in a way to learn. So yes, there's a lot of long, excessive writing and boring robustness checks that people do, but actually, you know, if you look at citations, longer papers actually get cited more. The more comprehensive paper that settles a literature tends to have more influence, despite, you know, at least in empirical work, than a flippant little result.
Right.
In theory, there's a more of a case that, you know, short papers like Spence's signaling and stuff have ended up being more important. There's not a lot of case for that in empirical work that I've seen.
Right. I feel like it's interesting, the themes that you brought up about competitive markets and the supply and demand framework. I feel like I never really heard as much about monopsony, but now I hear so much more about monopsony and anti-competitive labor markets, and even sometimes about antitrust and with respect to labor markets. And I was just wondering, you know, is it that these issues have changed over time, or is it just, you know, my attention to this is just, you know, not been as attuned to these
things go in waves. You know, Joan Robinson wrote about monopsony, you know, in the 1930s. It was developed equivalently with monopolistic competition in product markets. And, you know, when I was a graduate student, you know, decades ago, there still was a bit of a literature on monopsony, but I think the notion was, you know, I think before the more modern sort of dynamic models, that monopsony, you know, existed, but it was more an issue of isolated, you know, small company towns. So we thought of monopsony power being important in mining towns, but that in thick urban labor markets, like for, you know, fast food restaurants, people thought monopsony power was sort of a second order issue, I think. And I think the sort of modern interpretation that there are, but that, you know, that wasn't always true. I think a lot of labor economists in the mid 20th century, people like Lloyd Reynolds and his studies of the New Haven labor market, or a John Dunlop or a Sumner Slichter, thought there was a lot of imperfect information out there and a lot of monopsony power. Richard Lester at Princeton. And so it didn't, you know, it sort of was downplayed as being important. And when I was, you know, working out things like efficiency wages and rents were the sort of non-competitive market or union power rather than monopsony per se. I think Alan Manning really sort of pushed this in the early 2000s, late 90s. David Card has really gotten on there. And I think a number of macro people, I think, working out, you know, was the Diamond, Mortensen, Pissarides sort of model that frictions in the labor market, you know, from search, from commuting costs, could play an important role. But, you know, I've always gone back and forth on this because, you know, the sizes of wage differentials that seem to be associated with these frictions, you know, sometimes seem large relative to the friction. Could you really, you know, have people earn 25% less wage over their lifetime because of monopsony power, because it takes you, you know, 15 days rather than 10 days, you know, to find a job, you know, so there is some logical issues of how large the rents appear, or how, you know, are people, you know, maybe this is all psychology of leaving this on, but I still think you know, I'm not as convinced that we know for sure as some recent conclusions that, you know, there's a 25% markdown on wages on average. And so I think there is a push in that direction. And I think there are clear examples, you know, the market for nurses, there's no doubt we have great natural experiments of mergers showing increases in labor market monopsony power. You know, there's definitely evidence that teens, you know, are more tied to sort of their local restaurants and may not move that much. And people don't have perfect information about the alternatives, but how big a wage premium that wage markdown that generates. I'm a little skeptical of taking the elasticity of quits with respect to wages and taking sort of one, and thinking you've got the labor supply elasticity of the firm and inverting it, because in fact, there's all sorts of noise and quit rates that makes those elasticities hard to interpret. If they're a recruiting cost, there could be markdowns, but they may not be profits. They may just be the real cost of recruiting and other aspects that firms face. I think there's still a lot of open issues there.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't, it's a very big difference that if, firms have cost of hiring, recruiting, and screening workers, leading to a difference between marginal products and wages. And that's something that's not going to disappear, and that it's all market power and monopsony. And, an antitrust suit would change it. I think there certainly is we should be thinking of things that firms do to prevent worker mobility, whether it's, no poach agreements,
right.
non-competes when they aren't justified, and that's an important area. But whether the world is full of, complete monopsony power, we may have swung too much in that direction and sort of, but I'm very open to seeing better evidence today. But I think the current framework is, of more the empirical interpretation than, is a little overstated, but we'll see. I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I have just one more thing and then we can wrap up. It's kind of a connected thing. I was curious a little bit about what your concerns are or what your thoughts are about male labor force participation rates and where you sort of see that going, and also just what you are optimistic about going forward with respect to the labor in general and the future, well-being of American, or the American society in particular, but any world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's clearly, male labor force participation clearly has declined. It's sort of concentrated, among non-college workers. Some of that is, I think a lot of it has been the decline of higher labor market earnings, from the decline of sort of manufacturing, some sort of construction work, the loss of sort of, unions that played a role in providing support for sort of long-term careers and higher wages. So I think some of that is a response to poor opportunities. Some of that interacts with difficult to assess issues, with substance abuse and, the opioid epidemic. Some of it is an interaction with sort of criminal records and firm screening. We see currently in a tight labor market, firms being much more willing to relax screening criteria. And when the labor market's very tight, you do see a rise in male labor force participation and people who had poor opportunities sort of coming in. But, I think the way I sort of think of it is I think the poor, it's people care about their wages and sort of status. And a lot of the declining status has reduced some of the work effort. And the usual approach is, say, like real wages today are down a little bit relative to 30 to 40 years ago. And labor supply elasticities aren't big enough to explain the decline in participation. But if you said your wage relative to your sort of expectation of what a good life is by looking at how much the earnings increased, of your sort of your parents or other people you saw in your high school class who are doing better, and you saw how much worse your wages are if you don't have access to good college jobs and stuff, I think even with a reasonable labor supply elasticity, this starts becoming more understanding. I think that's probably more important than video games are so great.
Right.
I can't, prove that. But I think that, the decline in relative status of non-college workers and of pathways that gave you an identity and a job. And that's why I think things like sectoral employment training programs really push and giving people other opportunities, and and trying to sort of invest in recreating high wage, high productivity jobs for non-college workers, is such an important issue that we face right now. And this is not just true for men, it's true for women also. The education divide has been quite profound in the US.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Larry, I really appreciate you giving me, I know it's top of the hour and we only had an hour, but I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with me about labor and your own background. It's been really nice to talk to you.
Okay, great to talk, Scott.
Okay.
Sure.